Gurpreet, could we start with a little bit of history of Enserva? How did it get started? And I'm particularly interested in how you've gone from being in sort of an oil field services and manufacturing, and now you're incorporating clean energy services.
For sure. So previously we were known as the Petroleum Services Association of Canada, which started 40 years ago. There was a need where the service sector required a voice, and they wanted their own association, and lo and behold, PSAC was born, and it was mainly to advocate for the energy services, supply, and manufacturing sector. When I took on this role about 2 years ago, at that time the board had mentioned that members had started diversifying, and they wanted to see some diversification in Petroleum Services Association as well, like how would we be lobbying. And previously we used to lobby the federal government, but through CAP or EPAC. And our board members and our members wanted us to actually start lobbying directly. And then we realized that there's a subsect of the industry that just didn't think they had a voice, and they didn't have a voice within PSAC. And that started helping us with our rebranding exercise to talk about what does that look like for us as an industry, and do we just swap out the P for the E that seemed like what everybody was doing. And we said, no, we need to talk to everybody. So we went to membership and prospective membership and said, what do you want to see? So they wanted to see more of the energy mix in our association. They wanted to see that we were actually lobbying with all levels of government for this sector and take it into the future so that,
Well, give me some examples of clean energy companies that are now members of Enserva.
So here's what I would say is a lot of companies are in our service sector are transitioning and diversifying what they're offering. So you've got traditional pressure pumping companies that are now doing work in CCUS. You've got manufacturing companies that have gone into automation and have lowered their emission footprint. And so I wouldn't say that there's there's a clear divide. I would say service companies have always come up with innovations and technologies, and what they're doing now is diversifying within their own companies. But then we have companies like Futera that are specializing in geothermal, and it started from a producing company, and it said, let's try, how would this work if we started into the geothermal, and then they separated, and now Futera is a member of ours. You look at Epoch that started in geothermal many, many years ago before it was even a thing, and now they're part of our membership. We've got companies that are doing that are expertise in lithium, and they've now joined Enserva and became a part of a voice. We have a couple of companies that are in nuclear, and so I would say a lot of them have their own associations. What we offer is that we're not just a voice for certain pillars. We're a voice for the energy, service, supply, and manufacturing sector as a whole. And I think that's what attracts people to us, including those that are specifically in clean energy.
There's a lot of discussion around the World Petroleum Congress about the energy transition. What does it mean? And what does it mean to you and Enserva?
It's funny you asked this question, because I've been asked this a number of times today. And my answer is the same, is when it comes to differentiating between energy transition, net zero, what does this mean? And for us, it's the transition to a new energy mix has always been there. It just now has become this prevalent topic through government or media or whatnot. But when you look at the energy sector as a whole, we've always been transitioning into other forms of energy, because we all understand that there's an energy mix that's required in the world to keep up with demand, and it can't just be solely oil and gas. With that being said, it's also we're not transitioning away from oil and gas. We're transitioning away from higher emissions, and we're working together for a cleaner future. And I think a lot of our companies, you'll see that in there. Like, there's things that aren't talked about. Recycling water and reutilizing water, that is an effect. When you look at the emissions footprint that our companies are putting out, and from where we were and where we are today, it is a night and day difference. And so I wouldn't say we're transitioning away from oil and gas per se, is where the conversation has gone. Where we're transitioning away is from higher emissions.
So how many of your members now are in some aspect of emissions reduction? You mentioned CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. What other kinds of industries that are involved in emissions reduction are your members into?
So I would say majority of our members are in diversifying right now. If you look at our membership, like if I even give you an example of a chemical company, and they're members of ours, they have found a way and innovative where they can use half the chemicals than they used to that go down into the ground. And that's huge. Other members have now come up with hydrocarbon eating bacteria that actually soaks it all up from the ground. So I would say there's beyond CCUS, like that's what's talked about, but a lot of members are utilizing different aspects. So if you look at our drilling rig members, they have automated rigs that are using half the energy that was utilized prior. If you look at our camp members that run remote workforce lodgings, as we call them, they're utilizing solar panels to actually energize their facilities. And I think that's something that's not out there and talked about, but it's always been happening.
Are you finding that, and you mentioned a couple of examples, and that's why I'm asking the question, are you finding that companies are discovering that the technology that they've used for oil and gas has applications in other industries? Now, geothermal would be the obvious one with drilling companies and some of the producers, but are there other examples?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say I'm not your technical expert for sure, but like you said, geothermal is the obvious one, but that's obvious to those of us that are in industry. It's not obvious to general public, and it's not obvious to government in certain aspects. When we're talking about moving people away from jobs in oil and gas, like that's crazy talk as far as I'm concerned, because we need the same skill set to move into cleaner energy mixes. And geothermal is one, nuclear is another. We look at LNG, and I think the reliance on those countries that have reliance on coal, in order for them to get off of coal, like we as Canadians have a responsibility, and LNG could easily help those countries. I had a great conversation today with the delegation from India, and it was tongue-in-cheek conversation, but they said point blank, stop hoarding your LNG. And it's like, we're not hoarding it, we just have to work through some bureaucratic process.
Is there any discussion within your members and within, when you're talking to government, when you're talking to the producers, any sense that the energy transition also means the displacement of fossil fuels, where, say, in road transportation, where 50% of oil demand is used in cars and trucks and trains and so on. And they're already, like China already said that by 2025, their road transportation demand is going to peak. So is there any discussion of that? Is that commonly talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody's usually talking about, are we going to peak at oil and gas utilization? For sure. Is it going to happen by 2050? No way. Oil and gas will still be part of the mix. When it comes to electrification, it's already taking place, but is it going to displace oil and gas by 2030? No, it's not. I think what's being missed is there's an economic factor. And in order to get to net zero, it's going to cost, in Canada alone, it'll cost us over 1.2, 1.3 trillion. And in order for that to happen, we need people and we need money. We have a shortage of people right now. We don't have enough labor for today, and we don't have enough capital flowing into this country to actually make all of this happen. So it's great that people have these targets, but I know our sector, we've always talked about it. We're talking about, okay, what's next, and not worrying about, as people say, the noise, but it's a reality. We all get it. Like the world demand is gonna outweigh what's going to be available if we only rely on oil and gas. So there has to be a new energy mix, but oil and gas will be a part of it.
So everybody agrees that eventually there'll be a lot less oil and gas used, but it's the time frame that you think that by 2050 that there will still be as much oil and gas used as today, or there will be less, but Canadian producers can compete in that smaller market.
So I think, so there's two things, right? There's oil and gas demand and supply. There's not going to be enough supply to meet the demands of the future if we only rely on oil and gas. So that's why I'm saying our industry's been transforming, as they call it, or transitioning. We call it transforming to new forms of energy because we know what's coming down the pike. I think when government sets deadlines of 2030, 2050, and not to say they're not well thought out, but they're not well thought out with industry at the table to talk about, okay, so tomorrow you want to be at 2030, you're going to be net zero, no oil and gas because you're transitioning away from it. How's that going to even work? Right now in Canada alone, we don't have a grid system that's going to support that. Everybody's talking about the mega grid. There's still no discussion about how is this going to happen and who is going to pay for it.
So is it fair to say then, if I were to sum up what the conversations you're having, including with government, it's more around energy diversification as opposed to energy displacement?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a misconception, and I don't know where it came from. I'm new to the industry. I've been involved for 2 years. But there's this misconception that the energy industry is denying climate change and we're denying that we need to move into new forms of energy. That's never been the case. We've always said that, yeah, we need new forms of energy. And we've worked towards it, especially when it comes to, and I can't speak for the producers, but speaking for the manufacturing, supply, and services sector, we've always been on the forefront of innovation and technology to make things better and make it more streamlined and efficient. So why wouldn't we just keep doing that instead of having to fight against all this rhetoric against oil and gas all the time? It's such a waste of time.
Well, to wrap up our interview, Gurpreet, give me the top 2 issues that Enserva will be addressing over the next 2 to 5, maybe 10 years.
So 10 years is a long time. God knows what's going to happen in 10 years, but right now for the immediate future, I think in the next year, we're still tackling labor issues for our members. We're still tackling getting more capital coming into this country, making regulatory decisions that are pro-energy. We've had a lot of companies that have moved across the border and have said, you know what, forget it. We're not going to try new technologies here. We're going to go across the border and work in the United States because the investment environment there is far better than what it is here at home. And honestly, if we're going to actually stay competitive in the oil producing countries, we need to start being proud of what we do. And we can be net zero tomorrow. We're not going to make a dent in the world's emissions. And the only way we're going to make a dent is if we actually have an opportunity to start exporting to other countries. And that includes LNG. That includes, we need infrastructure. Like, I can't believe that certain parts of Canada don't want Canadian oil. They're okay with bringing it in from overseas where people have horrific human rights violations. Like, I understand there's a bottom line somewhere, but when you're looking at human rights in your own country, but then ignoring them at somewhere else, like that's mind-boggling to me.
Okay, well, Gurpreet, thank you very much.
Thank you.